Greetings and peace, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Tonight, I have the honor and privilege of being joined by my brother and friend, Dr. Bob Uzzel from Texas, who has written this great book about the history of Prince Hall Freemasonry in Texas. And it was such an honor and privilege for me to read this book and to read the contributions of great African-American leaders, not just to Prince Hall Freemasonry in Texas, but to the people of Texas at large, and how they contributed in their social activism, equality, brotherhood, our belief in God, all values that are advocated and practiced by Masons. So before we start this conversation, we represent ourselves only. We represent no grand lot statements or opinions. And with that, I welcome my dear brother and friend, Dr. Bob Uzzel. Thank you for being here, and thank you for this amazing work that you have gifted us with.
Greetings and peace.
Thank you, brother. So I would like to start with this question. What we know today as the Republic of Texas in its current shape, how has Prince Hall Freemasonry, including the different Grand Masters that have been in their roles, have contributed to Texas's current state, not just for African Americans, but for everyone?
Well, didn't you use the term Republic of Texas just then?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the Republic of Texas lasted from 1836 until 1845. 1836 is when Texas got its independence from Mexico.
Understood.
And then 1845 is when Texas became a state. And its Masonry played a major role in Texas from the word go. And there was interesting bit of trivia. The 5-pointed star, I'm not sure where that is in the book, but the 5-pointed star on the Texas flag alludes to the Masonic 5 points of fellowship.
Right.
And that's, I think it's quite significant. Before the Civil War, practically all the governors of Texas were Masons. The sole exception was Peter Hansborough Bell, for whom Bell County is named. I don't know why he was not a member, but he wasn't. Good evening, Brother Cox. Brother Knox, I'm sorry.
Greetings, brother.
Good evening.
You may be on mute.
Good evening.
Good evening. Glad to have you with us.
There he is. Good evening, Brother Knox. Thanks for joining us.
But unfortunately, as it shouldn't come as any surprise that Texas, being a southern slaveholding state, the attitude toward African Americans and other non-whites was not that good from the very beginning, although quite a few of the Mexicans who supported Texas, and some of those who didn't, were Freemasons. I currently live in Navarro County, and Navarro County is named for Jose Antonio Navarro. A few years ago, I attended a meeting in San Antonio. If you're ever in San Antonio, must stop on your itinerary is Casa Navarro. It's down on Laredo Street, downtown, between the police station and the jail. It's the home of Jose Antonio Navarro. He was a member of American Virtue Lodge number 10 in Saltillo, Cuyo, Mexico. And in most every country, Masonry's had some history, and in spite of the predominantly Catholic population, Masonry's had a great deal of influence in Mexico and in many Latin American countries. There's no evidence, by the way, that Jose Navarro ever visited Navarro County, but there's a big statue of him in front of the courthouse here. And Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin, a lot of those big shots of that period were Freemasons. And there's a legend that when Santa Anna surrendered and Sam Houston came to arrest him, he filled the air with the Masonic signs and gave Sam Houston a grip. But there's evidence, from what I've studied, he had committed a lot of crimes against Texas and Mexican Masons. And the only reason his life was spared was because he was worth more to Sam Houston alive than dead. But there was, from the early days of Texas, of course, during the time of slavery, there were no African American lodges in Texas. But shortly after the Civil War, it began. And of course, as you know, our Grand Lodge started in 1875.
Right.
And there is some, controversy. Since my book has came out, the question has come up about the chartering and who was responsible for that. And have you ever talked to James Morgan?
James Morgan, I'm aware of the brother here in the Washington, D.C. area, and
Yes.
He's on my list to reach out and interact with.
You definitely need to do that.
Definitely.
And in fact, he and some others are involved with the Prince Hall think tank. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to interview you on there sometime. I've been on there a couple of times, but he wrote a book on history of Prince Hall Masonry in the Old West. And he deals with William Matthews of the National Grand Lodge, a controversial leader. He's buried in Leavenworth, Kansas. And interestingly enough, he never was Grand Master of Kansas, but he was a resident of Leavenworth. And from what Brother Morgan tells me, I forget, it was just in recent years the National Grand Lodge officially dissolved. But he did come to Houston, I believe, in January of 1876 to install Norris Wright Cuny and his officers. And the first session of the Grand Lodge was held in Brenham in August of 1875. That's when it was organized. I've been to Brenham a few times. It's right across the street from St. John AME Church is the monument, because it was at St. John's where the church, the lodge, was officially organized when Norris Wright Cuny was made the first Grand Master.
And that's so beautiful you bring up Cuny, because reading this book, Brother Bob, I learned so much about how Cuny sacrificed in his life, how much he worked hard to contribute to the well-being of African Americans in Texas, and how his social activism was so much, regardless of his health, he kept up the good fight. He never gave up. And what really touched me were his final words before he passed to the Grand Lodge above, saying that my work here is done. And that really, really touched me as a Mason, Brother Bob. And I thank you for sharing what you did, which goes to my question. Out of this this list of Grand Masters that we learn about in this book, besides Cuny, which other Grand Master would you like to meet personally and learn from?
Abram Grant, for sure.
Hmm.
He was, well, actually, I guess if you've noticed, we had three Methodist ministers who became bishops.
Yes.
In their churches: Abram Grant, J.H. Armstrong, and J.W. McKinney. The first two were AME, the second was CME, third was CME. But Grant did so much for Texas and for both the church and the lodge.
And see, that's a great point.
He's buried in San Antonio. I have not been to his gravesite. It's at a Masonic cemetery on Commerce and Braunfels Street in San Antonio. In 1991, I believe it was, I went to San Antonio to speak at the Southwest chapter of the Philadelphia Society. A friend of mine, Jacob Casanova, invited me to speak, and I spoke about Bishop Grant. And I was Philip brought me to the meeting, to the breakfast. His name was Roosevelt, Tennessee. He retired from the Air Force and lived in San Antonio.
Yes.
Roosevelt passed away this last year, a very dear friend of mine. And you lose track of people over time, and sometimes you're surprised to learn they're no longer living. Jacob Casanova in Roosevelt, Tennessee, got together at that breakfast, and I'm not sure if they had any contact afterward, but I was going to get in touch with Jacob and let him know that Roosevelt had passed. And then when I did some internet research, I found that Jacob died a few years ago, so I didn't know. But they were both really good guys. Roosevelt, by the way, was from originally Faraday, Louisiana, and he played baseball with three cousins, not his cousins, but they were all of them became excellent musicians, playing three different types of music as piano players. The rocker Jerry Lee Lewis, the country pianist Mickey Gilley, and the controversial Pentecostal preacher Jimmy Swaggart.
Yes.
And you're a little young, but have you heard about the scandals of the televangelists during the 80s?
I've heard of them, like especially like going into the mid 80s and like into the late 80s. From what I've been able to dig up, I know that's before my time, but I know that how that has affected the community.
It was an interesting period. Well, in fact, in 1988, I attended the Philaxis Society convention in New Orleans. And at the time, Earl Bradford was Grand Master. And when he gave his presentation, he was talking about how there was, one of the charges against Freemasonry is being sexist. I think you did a blog a while back about co-masonry.
Yes.
And the fact that one of the ancient landmarks, in order to be a Mason, you must be a man. Even though they have the Eastern Star and other auxiliaries, some feminists, in fact, most feminists will say that's not good enough. Well, anyway, there was a woman who applied for membership in the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Louisiana back in the 80s. She got turned down. She was going to bring a suit against him. And Grandmaster Bradford and his officers met with her at a Louisiana motel and talked her out of filing suit. And he wanted to be known it wasn't the same motel Jimmy Swaggart went to. Yeah, but anyway, that's interesting. A lot of trivia out there. But yes, Grant was, and I had not known until a later time that he and Armstrong were brothers-in-law, and I did not. It was the former historiographer of the AME Church, Dr. Dennis Dickerson, told me that, and I asked who married each the other and sister, and he said they married sisters. And from what I gather, I think I know Bishop Armstrong died in 1898. He was buried in Galveston, and I think a few years later, Mrs. Grant died, and Bishop Grant married Mrs. Armstrong. I believe that was how it worked. And anyway, that's sort of unusual, but I've heard of things like that. Another prominent Texas Mason, Dr. D.R. Wallace, was married twice, and his two wives were sisters. And they're both buried next to him at Oakwood Cemetery in Waco. He was a member of my home lodge, Waco 92. And before we went on, I was telling you about working as a social worker and later as a chaplain intern at Terrell State Hospital. Dr. Wallace was the first superintendent. He was a pioneer Texas psychiatrist. And it's a very small world because in 1985, I got a historical marker for the cemetery at Terrell State Hospital for the centennial year. A decade later, I was working on a historical marker for the Pleasant Hill Baptist Church in Whitney, Texas. And when I began to do my research, I found that they had gotten they purchased the land in 1901 for $10 from Dr. D.R. Wallace of Waco, which that was, and even in 1901, $10 still, that was pretty cheap for a piece of land.
Right. And that's absolutely amazing, Brother Uzzel, what you have shared about these different Grand Masters and what they contributed to Prince Hall Freemasonry in Texas, which goes to my next question. Which Grand Master has done the most to uplift Prince Hall Freemasonry and the African American community of Texas?
Well, that's hard to say. John Wesley McKinney was in there for 20 years, so obviously a lot was accomplished during that long tenure. He later became a bishop in the CME Church. I knew I.H. Claiborne when I came in, and he did a lot both as Grand Master and as Grand Commander for the Scottish Rite.
Mm-hmm.
The current Grand Master, Robert Curtis, has been there a long time, and he's accomplished what no one had before him. I mean, as far as recognition, it's been a step-by-step process of gaining recognition from Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And I was told recently that he addressed earlier this month, the Grand Lodge in Waco. And they recently, at the same session, approved a motion to allow Prince Hall lodges to rent facilities, something that would have never happened during the time I was growing up. They started out with simple recognition. They just, okay, Prince Hall is legitimate. It's not clandestine. That's first step. Then they went a step further and allowed intervisitation with the consent of the two Grand Masters. Then they said, let the local lodges handle it. And now they can share the same building. So that's, I think we've taken some giant steps forward. Grandmaster Curtis, and I believe it was 2017, went to England. Because that they had the 300th anniversary of the Grand Lodge of England. You've been to England, haven't you not?
Yes, I was recently in England, and even in England, if you go into their library and museum of UGLE, they still have the historical records of Prince Hall communicating with the United Grand Lodge of England to request a regular recognized charter. And it shows how Prince Hall's journey started in Boston and how it went to England and then it brought here, and the origins of African Lodge for the sake of the upliftment of his community, how much sacrifice that he put himself through, and his hard work has paid off today with Prince Hall Freemasonry all over the United States. I think if he was alive today, he would be a very happy man to see this.
I know he would. I haven't been to England yet. I have, if I ever make it there, this place, besides the Grand Lodge of England, it's a place a little further north that I really want to go to, and that's Durham Cathedral.
Yes.
Do you know where Durham, in the north of England? Yeah, it's Old Norman Cathedral, the shrine of Saint Cuthbert. I listen to their worship services online quite often, and it's well, of course, we'll talk about this later, but the Durham name is a name that thoroughly fascinates me. My wife's maternal grandmother was a Durham, and another book that I've written is about her family tree.
Definitely. And that is so interesting, especially what Grandmaster Curtis has accomplished. And it's interesting to see how step by step, as a building a temple, how Prince Hall Freemasonry in Texas has been recognized now, not just nationally, but internationally, as a force of good and a force that is doing good things for the community. Which goes to my next question, Brother Uzzel, is how did Grand Masters overcome challenges when they were presented with bigotry or racism? They were being called clandestine. How did the Prince Hall Grand Masters leading up to Grandmaster Curtis fight these odds to get to the point where Prince Hall Freemasonry in Texas is today?
Well, I'm sure I wasn't there, but I'm like other aspects of life. People fought and did what they needed to do during time of slavery and later during time of segregation. And we got some new challenges now, as you know, with voter suppression and a lot of other stuff. But I'm sure we'll stand the test. But nevertheless, what I was going to say, I know that there were some steps that were not hardly recognized in the past. When Claiborne was Grand Master, I think it was 1975, the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Texas was a man from San Antonio, an attorney named Robert B O'Connor. I met him once. And he and Claiborne met together. When I asked Brother Claiborne about that, he pulled out a pocket piece that O'Connor had given him, and he said two men understood each other. No major changes occurred. I wrote O'Connor a letter when Claiborne died, and he wrote me a letter back that was very positive and had this. He was just. He said he was a good man and he will be sorely missed. He said we should be grateful for his stewardship and not despair of the future because his example and lives on. And that was very true. Now, I played a role in connecting two Grand Masters in the early 2000s. It was in the late 90s. It was, Robert Connor was Grand Master of Texas, and Joe Regan was the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Texas, and I wrote him and asked him would he be willing or interested in meeting with Connor, and he said he would, and they got together and actually met face to face. Although Joe Regan caught hell from that for a while, and they didn't actually have any formal dealings. But Connor and I had some problems along the way later on, but that was a few years later.
Right.
And it was. I'm glad that they were able at least to establish that much relationship. And when Connor died, I called Joe Regan and told him about it. And I understand he attended the funeral. I did not. Now, when Joe Regan died a few years later, his funeral was at the Scottish Rite Cathedral in Dallas. I did attend that. It's my understanding that Saturday night before he had passed away, during an installation ceremony, he was installing his son-in-law as worshipful master. He was handing him the Bible at the time that he had a heart attack. Well, that's better than being laid up in a bed with IVs all over the place.
Oh, it just shows you the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God, and how all of our work revolves around doing God's great work. And it's interesting how many people accuse Freemasons of being devil worshippers, while in the book, every Grand Master that I read about Prince Hall Freemasonry in Texas was a contributing leader of the church and building their communities through their ministries, through guiding people, building people up. So what would you tell those people, and how the Prince Hall Grand Masters have contributed not only to the growth of the fraternity, but also to the growth of those that are aspects of the church, and how that's contributed to the community and vice versa?
Well, the Black Church and Prince Hall Masons have worked hand in hand from the word go. Since 1975, I've been a minister with the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Right.
Have you been to Mother Bethel?
Mother Bethel, no, I have not.
And you live in Philadelphia? You need to go.
I will visit. I will visit.
You've heard of it. Okay. Deborah and I were there in 2016 for the Bicentennial General Conference. And I had the privilege of going down to the basement and kneeling and praying at the tomb of Richard Allen. And he and his wife, Sarah, are buried in the basement. By the way, her maiden name was Bass. And that was my wife's maiden name.
Yes.
But Richard Allen was the treasurer for African Lodge number 459 in Philadelphia, of which Absalom Jones was the worshipful master. I'm sure you've heard the story about the walkout at St. George's, when November 1787 at St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, black worshipers were pulled from their knees while in the act of prayer, and they walked out to form their own church. They left the Methodist Episcopal Church and they went to a blacksmith shop and held services. It became known as the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It's on that same site where the blacksmith shop formerly stood, is where Mother Bethel is today.
All right.
I think there've been 4 different church buildings. And in 2016, they erected a statue of Richard Allen in front of Mother Bethel. But there was actually 2 churches that came out of the walkout. The other was the First African Church of England, which is now known as St. Thomas Episcopal Church. And Absalom Jones was the first African American ordained as an Episcopal priest. Now, I think in the Saints' Day of the Episcopal Church, he's honored on February 13th. And interestingly enough, Richard Allen's birthday is February 14th.
That is fascinating, Brother Uzzel, and I definitely have to now visit the AME Bethel here in Philadelphia, and to go down and check all of the history that they have over there.
Oh, there's a lot of history there, and I have they have a lot of souvenirs for sale and all, and they there's a couple of different stained glass windows with square and compass. And I got a picture of the square and compass there and from Mother Bethel. And as I say, I would say Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were the counterpart in Philadelphia to Prince Hall in Boston. In fact, it's my understanding Prince Hall came to Philadelphia to install them in office.
That's right, because at that time, when African Lodge and its origins were going around, Philadelphia and Boston were like one of those key spots of the origins of a lot of those lodges. There's a lodge here, not too far away from my home, and a lot of those lodges that are here in this area still trace their origin back to that very event that you have said. So Philadelphia and Boston have played a huge role in Prince Hall Freemasonry.
Absolutely. And also, do you know that in my opinion, there was an event that's not stressed near enough. It was on December the 12th of 1900 that a meeting was held in Philadelphia in which Isaac Holland lived in Philadelphia. He was the imperial potentate for the Shriners. And this was a reorganization meeting. The ancient Egyptian Arabic Order Nobles of the Mystic Shrine was reorganized at that meeting. In 1893, it had started in Chicago, allegedly with the initiation of John G. Jones. John G. Jones, of course, was kicked out of Prince Hall Masonry in Grand Lodge of Illinois, and he was a real troublemaker, from what I hear. But the temples were renumbered, and Pyramid number 1 was in Philadelphia. Right. And it had been Palestine number 1 in Chicago, and it's Arabic temple number 44 in Chicago. I've often wondered how they got so far down the list. But in Philadelphia, that was, to me, that event in Chicago at the World's Fair, it was important, but they don't say enough about December 12th, 1900 for the reorganization and the role that Isaac Holland played. And Philadelphia is very important, to say the least. I was glad we were able to go there. We weren't there very long, but we enjoyed the time we spent there. It was my wife made the suggestion, we got to go to Mother Bethel. And for lunch that first day, we ate some Philadelphia cheesesteak.
Well, next time, Brother Uzzel, if you ever come here, you're always welcome in my home. And we would love to visit AME Bethel together. And also,
that'd be great.
I would love to do the same if I come down to Texas again. I think that would be absolutely fascinating.
And by the way, there's Bethel AME churches all over the connection, including the one that I pastor in Corsicana.
Right.
Bethel means house of God.
Well, see, so for the folks that are listening, Freemasons are men of God. And as you've seen how they contributed to the growth of the church, to the growth of their family, their communities. So Freemasonry and Prince Hall Freemasonry in general in Texas has done a lot of good for mankind, which goes to my next question, Brother Uzzel, is how did Prince Hall Freemasonry challenge racism in Texas throughout the years in terms of making sure that they as a brotherhood survived through the ordeals and through the times and what we know of them as today?
Well, I'm sure they faced opposition down through the years, and it's came back to the shrine.
Mm,
The big clincher case was in Houston
mhm,
in 1929.
mhm,
The first, well, I wrote an article about that called The Great Litigation Revisited. The first lawsuit was filed in Atlanta, Georgia in 1914 involving um, the Arab temple of the ancient Arabic order nobles of the Mystic Shrine against Raban temple, which is now Navarro temple of the ancient Egyptian Arabic order. And they had some other lawsuits, I think, in Arkansas and or maybe Tennessee and Louisiana, but it was in Texas is where the final litigation was involving Arabia Temple of the what's now called Shrine International
mhm,
and the Prince Hall Temple, which is Doric. And it was on June the 3rd, 1929, as a result of this case in Houston, that that black men won the right to wear the fez and call themselves nobles in the Mystic Shrine.
mhm,
And had it not been for that case, there might not be any black Greeks or Elks or Greek letter societies, whatever. This was decided in the cases of laches, Laches. That's a legal term. Has to do with delay. If you wait too long in equity cases, you can't claim exclusive right before the law.
right,
The white imperial potentate was aware in 1894 of Prince Hall Shriner's existence, but no lawsuit was filed for 20 years, and that's too long to wait
mhm,
for an exclusive right. And so that's based on that. And there was 1913, a similar ruling in a case involving the Knights of Pythias. So,
mhm,
and that's just, that affected the whole country with the Shriners. But I know that there was a time in Texas that white Masons would get in serious trouble even discussing Masonry with Prince Hall Mason.
mhm.
But those days are gone, thank God. And
Yeah,
it,
thankfully, Brother Uzzel, that is so important that you mentioned that because just recently, in the span of just this year alone, after the passing of illustrious John Lewis in Georgia, now we have Georgia, we have Tennessee. So just in a span of this short time, the list is getting smaller and smaller, where in the entire United States will be fully recognized, joint recognition with the Prince Hall Brethren, and we just have to give thanks to all of the brothers that have sacrificed so much for us to get
oh
to this
yes,
point.
absolutely. And I've heard there's some move in that direction in South Carolina. I'm not sure how far they've gone with it.
Mm,
There's a lot of resistance in Arkansas and in Mississippi, and Louisiana's got a unique situation. I won't comment on that. There's some problems in Louisiana,
yeah.
and all I've been told about West Virginia, there's a strong hillbilly influence there. So
Over time, my brother, I think time is ultimately what our faith and our fraternity teaches us to always trust God and always keep doing the right thing.
time, patience, and perseverance
Mhm.
uh, accomplish all things.
Indeed, my brother. And which goes to my next question. How did Prince Hall Freemasonry in Texas, Brother Uzzel, contribute to the social activism and to the upliftment of the African American community in Texas, whether it was through social programs, any kind of activism? What role did they play in that aspect?
Well, the halls have sometimes been used by other organizations in addition to finding overlapping in membership between Prince Hall lodges and various churches. You also find overlapping in membership with the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and National Urban League. They've contributed a lot to Black colleges and various charities, sickle cell anemia, and there's just been a lot that the Prince Hall Masons together. You know, you can accomplish more together. There's no power on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one, but union makes us strong. And another interesting area of study for some other time is the overlapping and the contributions of Freemasons to organized labor. Now, some of the unions still have rituals, not as much as they did in the past, but they use the term lodge rather than local, and that's a remnant of that period. The civil, quite a few. You look at the bios of many prominent civil rights leaders, and a lot of them have been Prince Hall Masons. As much as we'd like to claim Martin Luther King, unfortunately, we can't. He was not a Mason. He was an elk, I understand, but he was had a good relationship with Masons, and but quite a few of the others, including Justice Thurgood Marshall, and as far as I know, he was the last Freemason to serve on the court. I don't think we've had any since he died.
I believe he was the last one.
And he, Jesse Jackson and Andrew Young and Coleman Young and Benjamin Hooks.
That's
John Lewis.
Yeah, John Lewis. I think it's because of his efforts. Now we see joint recognition in Georgia when his funeral brought two grandmasters.
I was delighted. John Lewis, I never had the pleasure of meeting the man, but he brought people together when he was alive.
Yes.
And even in death, he brought people together because the white grandmaster and some of his officers, even though Prince Hall wasn't yet recognized, they came and helped the Prince Hall brethren to bury Brother Lewis.
That's it.
And
that's the greatest gesture of brotherhood.
Oh, it sure was. And then just about a year later, recognition came around, and it was there's other places that are dragging their feet, but they'll come around eventually. It's been largely in the South, but Virginia, of course, is an upper Southern state, and I knew the late Alan E. Roberts, who was he was a historian. You may have some of his books in your library. Yes. Alan Roberts. Yeah. I had the pleasure of meeting him in Washington, D.C. in 1987. He was a Virginia Mason. I read his book on Freemasonry and the Civil War. It's called House Undivided. And he was a strong advocate of Prince Hall recognition, as was the late Cabell Cobb's Grand Master. They're both deceased, but they didn't live to see it happen. But it's my understanding, Virginia took the first step like Texas did. They were earlier than Texas. Simple recognition with no intervisitation. A few years later, they approved visitation. And also, like North Carolina, it took a few years before they voted it down 2 or 3 times before they finally got it passed. And so it's been a long struggle, and some have taken the gradual approach. That's fine. It's I said back in the late 1990s, I said everybody's going to have to enter the 21st century in one way or the other, and some people will be brought in kicking and screaming. and that's these holdouts, these old codgers. There certainly have. But,
indeed, and I think
some are still kicking and screaming.
And that's absolutely right. And I think it will be hopefully in my lifetime, Brother Uzzel, as I'm 29, I'll be 30 by this summer. I hope in my lifetime I've lived to see where all states in America have this joint recognition. There is no racism, only brotherhood, unity, and the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God. Which goes to my next question, my dear brother, is what can mainstream state Masons learn from their PHA Prince Hall brethren in terms of exemplifying those Masonic ideals and values in your life? What can the mainstream learn from PHA?
Well, historically, PHA has been inclusive in the sense that all nationalities have been welcome to join. Not that many have. It's like some of the parallels with the church.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I listened to an interview. I don't know what year it was done. It was just this last year
Mm-hmm.
with Dr. Martin Luther King,
Mm-hmm.
and he was describing his home church, Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "We're segregated, but not segregating." In other words, they acknowledged this was an all-black congregation,
Mhm.
but they welcomed other nationalities as well. And there's many places, especially in the South and in the past, that white congregations did not welcome non-whites. That has changed for the most part. I'm not going to say it doesn't ever happen anymore, but it's less common that the person would be turned away from the church on account of their skin color. And the lodges, even though Prince Hall faced discrimination, they did not, for the most part, discriminate in return.
Mm-hmm.
And that idea of the principles, the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, it was not carried out perfectly, but carried out better than on the other side of the fence. And a lot of that has changed, and they recognize that you talk about fatherhood of God and brotherhood of man, then you have a color line. That doesn't make any sense at all. How do you wrap your mind around a limited universal brotherhood?
Yep, that's absolutely true, Brother Uzzel. And I realized in my travels, not only to England, but going to Pakistan, going to India, going to these different parts of the world, I realized no matter where you go in this world, there will always be a brother there to offer his hand in friendship, to relieve you of any distress, and to let you know that in your life you are never alone. You're always loved, protected, and watched over. That's how big this brotherhood is. So we can't let
And you
simple,
mentioned India.
yes.
I did a video a while back about September 11th,
Mm-hmm.
1893,
Mm-hmm.
the opening of the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago, which was a phenomenal event.
Yes,
And Vivekananda, Swami from India, gave the opening speech. He was a Freemason.
indeed.
And the harmony that prevailed there was such a contrast with the intolerance of 2001.
I know.
And I mean, it's so sharp you can cut it with a knife.
Yep.
And it was, there was, I don't know what, I did an article about the role of Masonry as a whole at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893,
Mm-hmm.
which the alleged cradle of Prince Hall shrined him. And it's some very interesting study there. It was Dr. George Washburn from, are you familiar with Robert College in Istanbul?
Yes, it sounds
It was a
familiar.
Christian school. I'm not sure if it's still operating, but Dr. Washburn was a president of this Christian school in an Islamic country in
Mm-hmm.
Turkey. It was called, it was Istanbul then, and was Constantinople. And he had heard about the Shriners when he came to America, and he was mystified by them partly because the alleged association with the Bektashi order of dervishes,
Yes, yes.
which is also a fascinating sect. I know you're familiar with them.
Yeah, the Bektashi basically they are a mystical Masonic sect within Sufism, meaning their initiatic experience, the way the hierarchy is set up, the way the Sufi lodges meet. you wouldn't be able to tell a difference if you were sitting in a Masonic meeting or a Sufi meeting. That's how deep the Bektashi are in their mystical teachings.
Yeah, their American leader died, I believe, in 1994.
Yeah.
Baba Ruxeb in Taylor, Michigan. Have you ever been there?
I have been to Michigan, but not the city of Taylor.
Yeah, that's by the Detroit airport, I understand. I haven't been to Michigan at all. It's an interesting state from what I've read. And
Yeah.
a lot of places I've read about I haven't been to. But anyway, the but I don't know who the head of it is now, but that would be an interesting place to visit.
Definitely. There's a lot of the Sufi leaders that I know that are representing these international orders. They're all based in Michigan. So Michigan is a powerful state in that regard.
Mhm. Yeah, I did 2 papers at Baylor on the Bektashi Order of Dervishes. Later rewrote them, put them together in an article for the Luxy Tenebris. And I needed some information to complete that my second paper. It was due on May 1st, 1987. And that information I needed arrived in the mail on April 30th, 1987, all the way from Turkey.
Beautiful.
Brother Akib, the Grand Chancellor for the Scottish Rite in Turkey, was the one who sent that information about the Turkish Masons and the Bektashis. And nobody can tell me that that's just coincidental. No, it wasn't. That was providential, if there ever was any such thing.
Exactly.
Over my life, I've seen so many examples of divine providence.
That's it. And that is what we're taught, is to put our faith in God and to know that the sublime plan of the grand architect of the universe falls in place in your life accordingly, with all the things that you're meant to do, people that you're meant to see, places that you're meant to go. It's such a beautiful divine plan, my brother, which goes to my next question. What would you tell those who still don't recognize their Prince Hall brethren, especially in the state that we are in today?
Well, I think they ought to. All of the stuff they did, again, come on, racism. That was something back then. Let's get away from that now. We need to move on.
Yes.
And as far as arguments for how it was chartered and this or that, dissent is important, but some of those issues related to recognition could be settled with a stroke of a pen.
Indeed.
Even if there was some problems with the origin, and I'm not sure exactly how to handle the non-Prince Hall Black organizations. There's some controversy over that, and a friend of mine made a statement one time, and it's actually pretty much correct, that many Prince Hall Masons tend to be as bigoted toward non-Prince Hall Black Masons as white Masons have been historically toward Prince Hall Masons. Now, Brother Morgan in his book points out that John G. Jones and William Matthews hated each other. These were two rival Black Masonic leaders, and the National Grand Lodge, it was called Prince Hall Origin.
Right.
And I've known some members of the John G. Jones affiliation in Texas. All of them are good men that I've known.
Indeed.
One of them, very good friend of mine, is now in Prince Hall, and I'm glad he came over. And it was a few years ago. I was actually pleasantly surprised that at Shrine Potentates Ball, Oblong Zakat, number 164 in Dallas, one of the members of Ali Temple number 93 in Waco, which is John G. Jones affiliation, came and wore his fez. And I told him, as far as I'm concerned, you're more than welcome. The thing like that is, unless there's a dress code, if a person has the money to buy a ticket and they want to wear a fez, if they paid for their ticket, unless there's a specific dress code, they can wear whatever they want to.
Exactly. And that's a great point, my brother, that you've touched on, and it's a lot of food for thought that for the audience that's listening. It's a lot to take in this beautiful history that Brother Bob Uzzel has given us of the contributions of Prince Hall Freemasonry in Texas. Which goes to my next question, my dear brother, is how did Prince Hall Freemasonry in Texas contribute to the civil rights movement? And what we know, I know the society today is still not perfect. There's still a lot of work to be done, but they have brought us very far in terms of things that we could never imagine, let's say 30 years ago or 50 years ago.
Oh, yeah. Well, um, they're Prince Hall Masons as individuals, were active in it. And you go through the proceedings, there's different pronouncements of different Grand Masters and Grand Lodges concerning the civil rights movement. And no doubt they contributed money to the different civil rights organizations. And sometimes meetings were held in Masonic halls and they lent their support to the NAACP and other organizations. So it's and I'd like to believe that many of the civil rights leaders are Masons. That lessons they learned in the lodge certainly were. That was not the only factor, but it certainly was a major factor in contributing to their views on civil rights.
Yes. And it's interesting you bring that up, because if you really look at all of the knowledge and history that has been taught, and I've really enjoyed reading your book, and I encourage all the audience to please check this book out so you get a true authentic source, as this is a scholarly work with sources, with references, which will show from Cooney to Curtis how much Prince Hall Freemasonry and the Grand Masters have contributed to the growth. And they're all God-fearing men. They're men of God. They love their brothers. They love what they've done for Texas and for each other. And it just blows my mind that so much of this information is not taught to us in terms of promoting the goodness of the fraternity.
Well, one name that we haven't discussed tonight that I think I need to mention,
Yes.
because his name appears a lot in my book, and that's William Madison Gooseneck Bill Mcdonald.
Yes, Gooseneck
You remember
Bill.
that name?
Yes, Gooseneck Bill.
I was, I did this internship at Terrell, where I worked back in the 80s. He was a native of Kaufman County, born near a place called College Mount. And he worked in Terrell at one time for the late Colonel E.H.R. Green, who was a railroad man. And he was, back in those days, most African Americans voted Republican prior to 1930s and the New Deal. When they left the party of Abraham Lincoln for the party of Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Yes.
But Colonel Green was white. He was the official head of the Republican Party in Texas.
Right.
But the man who called the shots was Gooseneck Bill Mcdonald. He started the Fraternal Bank and Trust in Fort Worth in 1912. That black-owned bank weathered the storms of the Depression and continued to operate. And then Gooseneck Bill died in 1950, and the bank was about 1957, I think it folded. Apparently, his heirs did not have his business acumen. So,
yeah, I mean, with Gooseneck Bill, he was definitely the one that exemplified, and he was himself a formidable force to deal with in terms of what he did for Prince Hall Freemasonry. And I was able to learn from this book about Gooseneck Bill.
And when the Republicans were in office, he was the one who called the shots for patronage in Texas. If he know about voter suppression, he'd turn over in his grave.
I know, and it's right now that's still a challenge that I believe many brethren that are being active in their communities. There's still a lot of work that still needs to be done, and all the things that have happened in Texas, fighting through the racism, getting the joint recognition, everything in our lives is a work in progress. And I think as time goes on, Prince Hall Freemasonry in Texas will continue to be that force of good, and the ship continues to sail on like you teach us in the book.
And with the mutual recognition, the lodges meeting together, I was taught, interesting point was brought out to me by a worshipful master not long ago who had visited a Prince Hall lodge, and I hope we'll see some improvement along this line. He said if we were to use printed rituals like Prince Hall does, we'd be excommunicated. And
Right.
I have taken to task many of the Prince Hall brethren over the years about they don't see it's necessary to memorize. They think reading from the book will suffice. And I totally disagree with that. And but I'm hoping that as they continue to meet together and learn from each other, that many more will realize you need to strive for excellence,
Yes.
not mediocrity.
Indeed.
And it's
Indeed.
easy, I mean, like going to be in a play. You got to go to rehearsal. You got to do this and that. You got to learn your lines. Well, I don't want to learn the lines. Well, then bye. We'll get somebody else who'll learn them. And so Masonic ritual is such a beautiful thing, and it's so much more impressive when it's memorized, when the words are pronounced properly,
Indeed.
and when the proper delivery, where the lessons are. You lose so much when someone just does it slipshod and passes over so much of it. Take your time, do it right. That's what I say.
It's interesting, Brother Uzzel, because I've seen Prince Hall brethren here in Philadelphia, and man, they are sharp with their ritual.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying there are a lot of Prince Hall brethren who are sharp, who are very proficient in ritualistic work. But and I hope eventually we'll see more of them like that in Texas.
Indeed.
Yeah, I'm glad that I know they're, and one thing you find a lot of those guys in military lodges too.
Yes, that's right. It's interesting. You bring up the military lodges. How has Prince Hall Freemasonry, especially a lot of our men and women in uniform who are serving our country, and I know many of the lodges that they meet overseas are usually Prince Hall lodges. So how has Prince Hall?
I do know that in Germany,
yes,
the most of the members of the lodges are black GIs, but there are some German nationals who joined. Back in the 90s, I had some contact with a German national named Chris Thomas, who was a member of Nero Prince Lodge in Germany. And he he wanted information on Nero Prince, the second worshipful master of African Lodge number 459. Initially, I wasn't able to find much beyond what Dr. Charles H. Wesley wrote in his book on Prince Hall. I later found in the Baylor bookstore several copies of a book called A Black Woman's Odyssey in Russian Jamaica by Nancy Prince, who was the wife of Nero Prince. They were, 4 or 5 copies, $1 a piece. I bought them all, and I sent Brother Thomas a copy of it.
Right.
It's only got a few mentions of Nero Prince, but when Prince Hall died in 1807, Nero Prince became the worshipful master of African Lodge number 459. And he, I understand, was a caterer. And there's not a whole lot known about him, but I think he spent some time in Russia and may work for the royal family there. I'm not 100% sure, but Nancy Prince described some of her experiences there. And they were, well, like I said, there's a lodge in Germany named for Nero Prince. And so there's some of that. There's Prince Hall Masonry is real strong around Killeen, where Fort Hood is. Yes. And I'm sure there's other places around military bases you find quite a few. And I know quite a few of my brothers. I'm not a veteran, but I know that quite a few of the brethren that are. And some of them are in the Killeen area. Some of them are around San Antonio because there's a number of military bases there. And I've spoken at some of the meetings. It's been a while, but I've spoken a couple of times at John G. Lewis Lodge number 622 in Copper's Cove. And John G. Lewis was the Grand Master of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge in Louisiana. Did you know Louisiana had one family in the Grand East for 77 years?
No, I did not know that.
John G. Lewis Sr. was Grand Master from 1902 to his death in 1931. His older son, Scott A. Lewis, was Grand Master from 1931 until his death in 1941. And the younger son, John G. Lewis Jr., was Grand Master from 1941 until his death in 1979.
That's amazing.
And my friend Joseph A. Walks Jr., I know you're familiar with that name.
Indeed,
Uh,
indeed.
Brother Walks was a great friend and mentor. He wrote a history of the John G. Lewis Jr. and the end of an era, the history of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
And
you know, Brother Uzzel, what stood out to me the most reading this book was Grand Master William Coleman. And at the time of his death in 1946, what the reporter observes, reading from your book, as the most worshipful Grand Master of the free and accepted Masons, he led in the completions of the mosque and establishment around the mosque of the playground, which not only makes it a monument to Masonry, but a beacon light of Negro enterprises for all to behold. Probably most significant of his leadership was the fact that Free and Accepted Masons was one of the few men's fraternal societies in Texas, if not the only one to come through the Depression without any loss of poverty or substantial decrease in its steady building impulse. It shows what kind of a great man William Coleman was, and I thank you for sharing William Coleman.
Well, I quote a friend of mine in there, O.E. Wilhite, who he said he was his favorite Grand Master.
Yes.
And he lived down in Lockdale, Texas. And that story was so funny. When he was senior warden, the worshipful master of his lodge at the time had been collecting like a quarter a month from all the brethren for the widows and orphans. And when he was asked for the money, he didn't have it. And Brother Wilhite reported it to Grandmaster Coleman. And he said, "What'd you do with the money?" "I needed it for stamps and writing." Let me tell you something. You better not ever take another penny, because if you do, I'm going to send you to the pen. And I interviewed him in 1992 at Grand Lodge. And then he passed away in January of 93, and I went to his funeral at Allen Chapel, AME Church in Rockdale. And I was at it was Good Friday service there a couple of years ago, and his granddaughters were present. So
that's beautiful.
I really thought a lot of Brother Wilhite. He was a retired school teacher, just a remarkable man. He would have been worshipful master a long time, I think.
Thank you, Brother Uzzel. And this goes to my next question. What is it that I have not asked you that you would like to share from the teachings of Prince Hall Freemasonry in Texas? Or anything from this book?
Well, I think it's an outstanding fraternity, and it's done a lot of good in Texas and beyond. And you can make the case for that in many other states. And I said that despite criticisms without and conflicts within, I'm convinced that Freemasonry has what it takes to survive. Within the African American communities, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas has always met the challenges. I have no doubt it will continue to do so until time shall be no more. So might it be.
Thank you, Brother Uzzel. And it's so interesting, this lesson that we learned from Prince Hall Freemasonry in Texas, and such a formidable force that it is for good. And I thank you so much for joining me for this talk and giving me your time. So, my brother, I love you dearly. I send my brotherly love to all the Prince Hall Freemasons in Texas. What closing thoughts would you have for our audience?
Well, let's ask Brother Knox to make some remarks.
Brother Knox, please unmute yourself.
I missed the question.
We just want you to say something, make some remarks. Hope you've enjoyed the program tonight.
Yes, I did enjoy the presentation. I was lucky to find your post on Facebook, and I decided to join this evening.
Well, you were more than welcome. Now, what lodge do you belong to?
I'm a member of Sons of Light Lodge number 61, where I serve as junior warden. We're a subordinate lodge of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of South Carolina. Where
Well, what is we mentioned South Carolina a while ago. That's one of the 5 states where Prince Hall is not recognized. Is there
Right.
any progress?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Give it time, there will be.
Yes, sir.
I was in South Carolina in 2012, almost 10 years ago. It'll be 10 years this August. What city do you live in?
Rock Hill.
I've heard of Rock Hill. Do you know where Winsboro is?
Yes, I do. It's about an hour away from Rock Hill. Rock Hill is near the North Carolina.
Okay.
State.
Well, do you know what county Winsboro is?
That's Fairfield County.
Fairfield County, that's right. And
Yeah.
I have another book if Brother Sheikh would like to have a discussion of a non-Masonic book at some time.
Oh, of
It's
course.
The Durhams of Fairfield, an African American genealogy. My wife's is descended from an African named Gabi, who was a slave in Fairfield County, South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
his descendants came with their master to DeSoto Parish, Louisiana, and later to Fairfield, Texas, one Fairfield to another. And it's a fascinating journey, but there's a lot of Durhams, white and black, up there now. Well, what primarily black Durham. Some of them are buried in 2 cemeteries I visited, and but it's our experience. My son-in-law and 2 granddaughters went with me, and the Palmetto State was outstanding. We didn't meet one mean person in South Carolina. Everybody we met was nice, and they really seemed like they wanted to help us.
That's beautiful.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
So, Brother Uzzel, you have any closing thoughts for the audience? Anything you would like to say?
No? Yeah, order my book. It's available on Amazon.
So please check out Brother Bob Uzzel's book, Prince Hall Freemasonry from Cooney to Curtis. And this is a beautiful book, and I hope tonight's discussion, my brothers and friends who are listening, has benefited you in some way. So to conclude this presentation, I would like to read the first address of Grandmaster Grant, which he gave in June 7, 1882, from Brother Uzzel's book. So starting, assembled in these consecrated walls for the discharge of the important duties entrusted to our supervision and the full enjoyment of peace, there is every reason for the expression of profound gratitude to Almighty God, that despite our frailties and shortcomings, his tender care has been ever manifest, and for humble aspiration that the present session and proceedings may so be conducted, that not only shall they profit our venerable craft, but also redound to the greater glory of our Heavenly Father, to whose name we ascribe all honor and praise. You have come here to declare your appreciation of the character and the objects of Freemasonry, to record your homage for its founders and admirations of its splendid charities, and dedicate yourselves to the permanence and perpetuation of its principles. And we should leave here alone for the generations which are soon to fill our places, some proof that we endeavor to transmit the greater inheritance unimpaired, that in our estimate of its principles, in our veneration of its charities, in our devotion to its morality, in our regard for whatever improves human happiness, we are not altogether unworthy of the high trust confided to us. Other places and other occasions you reserve for strife and disputation, and struggle for mastery in the sharp competitions of life. But here shall be peace and reconciliation. Within these walls, the knowledge and the morality, which are of no creed and no party, which are graceful and profitable for all alike, which are true and real to every mind and to every conscience and in every brain and heart, these alone are inculcated here. Happy especially if we shall rouse ourselves to their utmost capacity, if we shall feel that we are summoned by new notice and by an obligation unfelt before, to an unaccustomed effort to appropriate to our hearts and reason all the countless good which is hidden in the principles and teachings of Freemasonry, I recommend the creation of a permanent committee on history of Freemasonry in Texas and its jurisdiction. The works of this committee will be cumulative, suggesting of itself their line of investigation. The committee should be charged with the preparation of biographical notice of all elected officers in the line of the Grand Lodge to be published annually with the proceedings. Most Worshipful Grand Master Samuel W. Clark of Ohio has proposed the celebration of the 100th anniversary of Freemasonry among colored men on the completion of the century. September 1884, I recommend that a committee be appointed whose duties it shall be to open correspondence with all Grand Lodges in the country with reference to the proper observance of the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the lodges of Freemasons among colored men on this continent. God be thanked for books, says Emerson. A higher culture, loftier attainments alone fit us to meet the enlarging demand of the time and crisis, which swiftly approaches. Books are the voices of the distant, and the dead make us heirs of the spiritual life of the past ages. Books are the true levelers. They give to all who will faithfully use them the society, the spiritual presence of the best and greatest of our race. I would therefore recommend that each member of our fraternity in this jurisdiction to be taxed 10 cents annually, and said tax to be appropriated to purchasing a library to be placed as a cornerstone of our Masonic temple. Surer foundation can no man lay. Let us take pride in its growth until it shall educate the jurisdiction in the principle and practices of virtue, and make for us a reputation for intelligence worldwide. Appoint a custodian of said library. Many friends stand ready to help with money and donation of books. Let all the grand and past masters and secretaries be requested to deposit with said librarian originals or copies of all letters sent or received pertaining to the history of the Grand Lodges and all circulars, notices, etc. My brethren, I approve this opportunity to thank you heartily for the honors with your partiality has for this year conferred upon me, and for the confidence implied by your actions in the performance and my duties I have sought faithfully to administer the laws in practicality, the principle that arose that are governed best who are governed least. And this is Grand Master Grant on his first address on June 7, 1882. And his words today, Brother Uzzel, are so true about education, about reading the books, and knowing that in times of crisis, such as the post-2020 COVID world that we're living in, we need to stick together, honor the cornerstones of our temples, our rough ashlars becoming smooth ashlars, and continue this struggle for equality, for education, and making sure that everything gets passed down. So Grandmaster Grant's words are still alive today in 2022, and we have much to learn from it. My dear brother and friend, I thank you dearly. I love you dearly. And I thank you for this great work that you have produced. And I highly recommend to all the audience listening, please support Brother Uzzel's work and learn about what Prince Hall Freemasonry has done for Texas.
Thank you.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you. And my thanks to yourself, to Brother Knox, and to all of the audience listening. I hope you enjoyed this wonderful evening and presentation. God bless each and every one of you.
God bless you too.